Makahanya haramita shingyo Genji Saiboza Gyojin Hanya haramita jishoken gon Gai Gudo Isai Gu Yaku Shari Shiki Fui.
Picture number 9. Return to the origin, back to the source. In the origin, all is pure and there is no dust. Collected in the peace of non-volitional doing, he beholds the coming and going of all things. No longer deluded by shifting phantom pictures, he has nothing further to learn. Blue runs the river, green range the mountains. He sits by himself and beholds the change of all things. So here we are at our penultimate picture in our series of the 10 bull herding pictures, or the bull and his herdsman, as this is commonly known. And looking at this picture, we might be forgiven for thinking that this is somewhat similar to that first picture, a sort of picture of, well, nature. In the first case, it was very definitely a wilderness, and certainly we might think, well, maybe we're up on a mountain peak somewhere here, on some kind of rocky crag, because what we have is very much a natural picture, and there's nothing in it apart from a few plants growing and some rocks. But just take a look at that tree, that branch that fills the space in the center of that picture. We can see that it's in flower, and this tells us that here we are in spring. And perhaps if we know our mythology and we know our archetypes and our Joseph Campbell and so forth, after the last picture, which is both bull and man forgotten, that empty circle, it's also sometimes as called by Master Hakuin the Great Death, it should be no surprise that we see, following on from the Great Death, spring. In other words, rebirth, death and rebirth going together, which seem to be sort of playing themselves out, but very much in a way that goes beyond the norm, goes beyond the simply human. This is a grand picture. There's something deep and profound about this, and as has already been pointed out, we have entered upon the truly religious now. We've left behind the purely psychological. We've broken through, so to speak, to a realm that truly is other to I, and therefore it's quite mysterious. So yes, we have this rebirth here, and there's a wonderful saying in Zen, a wonderful Japanese Zen saying that goes, "In the landscape of spring, there is neither better nor worse. The flowering branches grow, both long or short." In the landscape of spring, there is neither better nor worse. Well, can that be said of when I look at the landscape of spring? I happen to live in a city, and when I look out of the window, I mean, I'm up in on the 12th floor, and I have a great view of London, but I may be thinking, it would be so much better in spring with those flowering branches, all the trees in bloom, if I was out in the country. I mean, I can see some green, and actually walking around London, you can see quite a few flowering branches. But, I sort of think it would be a better environment if I was somehow, maybe in a park even, might be better, but even better in the country. And then, maybe it would be even better if I went to Japan, and there I could see the beautiful cherry blossom. This is the picking and choosing I do. So walking around, in fact, what the treasures that are there laid before the eyes are not really seen. They're obscured by my judgments, by my picking and choosing. And this is why the third patriarch, Master Sozan, says in his great poem on faith in the heart, "The great way is not difficult. it merely avoids picking and choosing. But that merely avoids picking and choosing, there's a real rub there. That is not easy to do, because that inner narrator is going 10 to the dozen quite a lot of the time. Always that. And when we look at what that picking and choosing centers around, do I like it? Do I not like it? Does it suit me? How will it affect me? What do I think of it? What's my opinion on it? There at the hub of it, we have that notion of I. And this notion of I, of course, is what the Buddha said in reality does not exist. And in this reality, return to the origin, back to the source, it clearly does not. And we may now be thinking, well, in order to return to the origin, back to the source, I have to rush now up to some remote mountain peak and there sit atop and experience that origin and that source. But unfortunately, we take all our baggage with us. We take this delusion and this picking and choosing with us wherever we go. And another Zen master said, if you really want to find that origin and that source, then you must turn the heart around and return to that origin. Do not chase after what comes out of the origin. In other words, what comes out of the heart, do not chase after it. Turn round and go right to the very source, which literally means, because that origin, which is our own heart, is spewing forth all the time. And if we trace a single thought or a single mood or a single, as they're called, the mental configurations, we just follow it right back to its very source. There it is. I cannot enter the source. Of course I cannot, because I am one of the products of it. Even the notion of I springs out of that source. Deluded though it may be, it all has its foundation. If we want to put it Buddhistically, then of course we're in the realm of the Yogacara and the Alaya Vijnana, or the storehouse consciousness, which the surface, well, what we see in that clear seeing, when the heart is truly quiet, what we see is the surface of that storehouse. But I cannot go in. That source remains a permanent mystery. There's the Hindu story of the god of wind and the god of fire, who come across the mysterious cloud which defeats their great powers. The god of wind cannot blow the feather that the mysterious cloud gives him as a challenge, and the god of fire cannot incinerate or even scorch a stalk of corn that the mysterious cloud gives them, and it terrifies them. And it's not until a passing goddess tells them, well, no, that mysterious cloud, that is the source of all of us. In other words, we spring out of it. Our powers, our thoughts, our moods, the 6 realms, the 10 directions, all spring out of that origin and that source. And here we are in spring with our picture, those flowers bursting forth from the branches. Because, why? Why do they do it? Do they do it for something? Maybe I think they do it because they want to be pollinated. Oh, look, Mr. Bee, come and pollinate me, please. Just look how lovely I am, how delicious I smell. But they don't. They don't at all. They bloom because it's their nature to bloom. And the pollinating insects that come, do they also think, now, how much will I earn for this nectar and this pollen? And maybe I can bump that other bee off and get that bigger flower. No, they simply follow their own nature. And by following their own nature, by nature following its own nature, then somehow things happen, things work out. The flowering branches flower, the pollinating insects visit and pollinate, and also collect nectar for the hive. And the trees can now bear fruit, and the reproductive cycle continues. The fruit falls and dies, of course, and then the following year the new shoots come forth once more. Meanwhile, above, and those flowering branches, another series of flowers come forward. We would love to know what happens when I die, don't we? Because we have to remember this This picture number 9 follows on the great death. Where is it that I go? And we create all sorts of pictures, don't we, about what will happen to me when I die, and we cling to them. And we may be optimistic, and we may say, well, there's an afterlife and we go to heaven, or there's an afterlife and we go to another incarnation somewhere else, maybe another human, maybe a dog or a cat or an ant or something. And so it goes on. Or nowadays, a lot of people think, well, when I die, that's it. Nothing. It all stops. But all these things are my conceptions. These are the conceptions of the living. And the living are not dead. And I cannot conceive of what it is to be dead. So death, too, is that mystery, too is that source. What happens beyond? Well, we have pictures. But even if I think that something comes back from the dead, maybe I'm clairvoyant or and so forth, this is still in the realm of the living. These pictures at best can only be an approximation. They cannot be the whole, because if it could truly be conceived, then there would be no mystery anymore. And this origin is a mystery. What happens behind the curtain, so to speak? We can see what happens in the front of the stage, but what happens behind the curtain? Well, we infer, we guess, we paint pictures, which is what we always do when we do not understand something. I try to grasp it by my intellectual skills, by my understanding. But here it falls down. Here it falls down completely. There's no going beyond. Not for I. In the origin, all is pure, and there is no dust. When we come across this word purity, in Buddhism, we don't want to make the mistake of thinking somehow that this is a purely moral term, although it can certainly be used for behavior. But it actually refers to emptiness, the teaching of shunyata, that all things are empty. And this doesn't mean that they're nothing. Not at all. There are still up and down, there's still chairs and tables, there's still men and women, there's still life and death. But that these things have no self-nature in themselves. And really this goes back to this particular teaching of emptiness, or shunyata, was formulated officially by the great Indian sage Nagarjuna in the 2nd century in India. And he pointed out that because everything is impermanent, and we know in Buddhism this is a central teaching, this is one of the 3 great signs of being, that all things are impermanent, all elements are impermanent, all phenomena are impermanent, without exception, wherever we look, in the physical world, within ourselves, in the inner landscape, in the mental realms, they're all quite impermanent too. And that any phenomena that do temporarily arise do so because they're dependent on causes and conditions outside of themselves. Take a common analogy. If we consider a candle flame, for example, it's caused by oxygen and also fuel and ignition. Those are the 3 things that must come together in order to produce that candle flame. And if one of those causes and conditions should change, such as the oxygen runs out or the fuel runs out, then that candle flame ceases. And this principle that everything that exists, which of course includes me, exists because it is dependent on causes and conditions outside of itself. And when those causes and conditions, being subject to impermanence, change, then everything changes. And because of this, Nagarjuna pointed out, we cannot truly say where the causes end and the effect, say the candle flame or me, begins. There's a sort of gradation, there's a sort of running into, rather like 2 wet colours on a surface, and when they run into each other there's a sort of merging. The edges are no longer distinct, they are not separate, and the separateness of course is a characteristic of the idea of I. I am me and you are you. There's me and other. And never the twain shall meet. We may face each other. We may be allied. We may be in opposition. But we are never one. We are always separate. But Nagarjuna pointed out in this way that nothing is truly separate, and therefore nothing has self-nature. Therefore, he concluded, all things are empty. All things are empty of any form of self-nature or separateness. And this is what it means. In the origin, all is pure. There is no dust. And this is why we have to be careful with our translation, because emptiness, which is the usual term, English term that's applied to the Sanskrit shunyata, has often been translated as void, giving the impression that it's some kind of sucking black hole into which everything falls and there is nothing and it's meaningless and all the rest. And this is not the correct connotation. It's inaccurate. What emptiness really refers to is the total and complete interconnectedness and interpenetration of all things. This is the heart of the teaching of the Avatamsaka Sutra, known as the flower garland scripture, which is several large volumes of Mahayana teaching, very profound, upon which the Chinese Huayan school happens to be based. And the thesis, if you like, of the Avatamsaka is the one in the all and the all in the one. And it gives fine examples, saying a universe can be found inside a mote of dust, and yet the universe does not shrink down, and neither does the mote of dust expand. Things are just as they are, and yet within a single mote of dust, the tiniest thing, exists the entire universe. And the entire universe can be found inside a single mote of dust. Really very profound, really setting the opposites clashing there in true Mahayana form. So in the origin, all is pure, and there is no dust. And this reminds us, this dust perhaps alludes to those twin verses of the sixth patriarch. We remember the story of Enodaikan, who was the young man who, upon hearing a verse from the Diamond Sutra, gained a profound insight, and then travelled to the north of China to find the fifth patriarch, Gunan. And Gunin recognized his potential, Daikan's potential, but he was a layman, set him to work in the rice hulling shed, and then shortly afterwards he needed to seek his successor, and so asked everyone to compose a verse to say, well, to demonstrate their insight. And everybody thought, well, the head monk's going to get the succession, so we won't bother. But the head monk himself wasn't so sure. And so he went to a part of the monastery where some decorating had been taken place, and he daubed on the wall his verse, and his verse went, this very body is the tree of enlightenment, and the heart is a bright mirror upon a stand. Constantly wipe that mirror every single day, so that no dust may alight on it. And really, this is our standard daily life practice. This is really what we do. Our practice, which is to give myself wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done, whether it's in the activities, sitting, standing, walking, lying down, getting on with things. We just give ourselves back into what at this moment is being done. If it's doing the washing up, it's doing the washing up. If it's having to do a job that I don't particularly like, then it's pulling myself together and really giving myself to overcome the inertia and finding that it's now possible to give myself wholeheartedly into it. And of course what happens is that I start thinking about something else. I think, oh, this is a bit boring, and I start musing on something else, or I put the radio on. And so I split myself in two. But this is when we catch ourselves doing this, we turn the radio off, and if we're daydreaming, we recognize that we're daydreaming, and quickly as possible jump back in, give myself wholeheartedly into what at this moment's being done. And this is wiping the dust away. It's wiping the dust of the mental configurations, wiping the dust of, oh, I don't want to do this right now, or what is it that I must be doing after I'm doing this, or how well am I doing it, or is this better or is this worse, do I not like? All those I-based things are swept away. Those are the layers of dust that have to be swept off that mirror. And if they're swept off that heart mirror, then the heart mirror shines and it reflects things as they really are. And our task is just to keep it clean. It's the same in the sitting meditation. We have our breath, we have our count on the breath, on the out breath, and whenever the thought strays into dust, quickly we jerk ourselves back in, and come back to the object of meditation. And in that way, this is also sweeping the dust. So whether it's the sitting meditation or the daily life practice, what's sometimes called mindfulness practice, it's exactly the same principle, that dust wiping. And this is what the head monk put. And when Master Gunan, the fifth patriarch, saw this, he knew that his own monk, whilst he was certainly carrying out the instructions for practice, had not actually penetrated through to the fruit of that practice, had not penetrated through to the realization of emptiness itself. But he said to the assembly, he said, this is an excellent verse. If you follow it, it will bring you release and what you seek. And so people started walking around reciting it. And he said, if you put this into practice, started reciting it, and the sixth patriarch got to hear this because he himself couldn't write, it's said, according to the tradition, or read. And so when he heard this, he also knew that the that the head monk had not penetrated through to emptiness. So he asked another monk to write up a corresponding verse, a matching verse next to it. And Aino's verse went, "There is no Bodhi tree. The bright mirror has no stand. When there is nothing whatsoever, what dust can a light wear?" And literally with that, he wipes the whole thing clean. And of course, the mistake that we make with that, seeing these two verses, is that we think that the head monk's is wrong, and because we know that Aino became the sixth patriarch, we think his verse must be right. But they're not. They are a match pair. They go together. That this is the path. This is the Mahayana path, the path of training, and then the realization of emptiness as well. One's own realization of emptiness, realization of the source and origin, which is that emptiness itself, is the source of all phenomena, and it underpins them all too, and is their nature. And as a result, Aino Daikin got the transmission, the robe and bowl, and became the sixth patriarch. So this is that dust here. Collected in the peace of non-volitional doing, he beholds the coming and going of all things. Non-volitional doing. The Chinese for that is Wu-Wei. Also another oft mistranslated word. Can be translated as non-action. So somehow we just sort of sit ourselves down and everything falls into our lap. But this is not the case. This is not what it means. Non-volitional doing is a much more accurate translation. In other words, well, going back to our flowering branches, they flower because it's their nature to do so, not because they're trying to attract pollinating insects. That's the difference. And there again we have that rather nice Zen verse that goes deep in the forest, away from prying eyes. The cherry tree blossoms from the fullness of its own heart, or from the sincerity of its own nature, we could say. Away from prying eyes. It doesn't do so because it wants to be admired for how pretty it looks. Yet in Japan, as has already been mentioned, people go to view the cherry blossoms. The cherry blossoms themselves do not vie with each other to be gawped at. They're simply obeying their own nature. And this underlying harmony runs very much through Chinese thought. Obviously the Chinese had it already with Taoism, with the Tao, which has similar, though not the same, connotations as the Dharma as well, which also is that, well, the Dharma is often translated as the law, which is not in a sort of Judge Dredd type law from on high. It's the inherent law that that the nature of things is inherent in phenomena itself, not apart from it, all part of it, and it expresses itself through things and through us too. And so our task is to simply get out of the way and stop obstructing it. And this is the meaning when Master Hyakujo was asked the question, does a man of the way, is he free from the law of cause and effect? Which is cause and effect, whether it's karma or any of the forms of causality, is the principal way that things come to be and cease to be. They have causes and conditions. Nagarjuna made that point too earlier. And Master Hyakujo replied, the man of the way does not obstruct them. The man of the way does not. He does not fight them. He's able to look things squarely in their face. And Master Rinzai, founder of one of the great houses of Zen, he said, when someone comes or something comes, I go out to meet it. This is not something that I necessarily do. I make pictures of it, make ideas of it with my judgments, and if it frightens me, then I try and hide from it. And if I fear losing it, then I will run after it. But things come and things go. Things come and things go, and this is the nature of things. This is precisely the nature of everything. And it's not, again, that I now sit there and say, oh, there's an old lady being mugged, therefore things come and things go, she's losing a handbag right now. Well, that's just the way it goes, because that would be inhuman, and that would lack any human feeling. But neither is there a raging against it, neither is there declaring war on those things that I think should stay, or declaring war on those things that I think should never arise in the first place. This is the Buddha's middle way again, and this is really what the meaning of the Buddha's middle way points to. It points to emptiness. He beholds the coming and going of all things. No longer deluded by shifting phantom pictures, he has nothing further to learn. And of course, with us, that learning is often a means to an end. With my understanding, with my learning, I seek to grasp and to control and to take hold of things. This is a way that to make myself feel safe. Always, it's shoring up that little inflatable mannequin called I. But the mannequin is leaky, and it's constantly leaking gas, and it's, as fast as I try and pump it and make it rise up, it just as quickly it also begins to deflate. And so it's a constant battle. I'm constantly asserting myself, constantly having to feel special, constantly having to feel that there's something that I must be doing. I doing. This is why boredom terrifies me. I don't like to do nothing, because doing nothing means what? I become nothing? Blue runs the river. Green range the mountains. Yes, the river water is blue. Well, I may wish that it was purple or yellow. That would make life more interesting, but it isn't. It's blue. And that blue is a deep blue, and it shines. And green range the mountains. Things are as they are. There's another old Zen saying, in the beginning, the mountains are the mountains, and the trees are the trees. And then the mountains cease to be the mountains, and the trees cease to be the trees. And then in the end, the mountains are once again the mountains, and the trees are once again the trees. And we might think, we go all round the houses just to come back to where we were. But in one sense, yes, we do. But in another sense, We're no longer the same. We're not the same. That third stage is not quite the same as the first, though the seeing is the same, because what we have in that third stage is a maturity now, whereas in the first stage I was a baby and was quite unconscious and subject to everything. Now there is that beholding, and that's a wonderful world, beholding, isn't it? He sits by himself and beholds the change of all things. Sometimes when people talk about the practice of mindfulness, we tend to use words like observing or watching, and it's a very short step to go from observing to I observe, and from watching to I am watching, as if somehow I am sitting apart from everything. Here I am, I'm looking at some mint right now, and it's just shivering slightly in the breeze, and I can see the different hues of green and the sort of purpley red stem, and I can see the sun shining through the leaves, and I can see the segments of the leaves, and it's all very interesting to me whilst it lasts. But there's still that separation there. We haven't truly become together. But that word behold, well, it's rather like the word beholden. It means to be taken hold by something. It means that the thing itself, rather than I looking at it, actually it has taken hold of me, beholden to it. It has that sense of awe, that sense of wonder as well, which is really very much a mark of that quiet spaciousness, that samadhi. Rather like a work of art or a piece of music sometimes just takes hold of us. This is beholding, and we hear it in its entirety. If in that moment, because what happens in that moment of beholding something is that for a moment it throws out I, and the heart becomes vast and wide and spacious, and whatever it is that is being beholden now is the landscape, and it's seen in its entirety in the round. And this really has that almost physical quality to that beholding the blue river, beholding the green range of mountains. He sits by himself and beholds the change of all things. And I remember my own teacher shortly before she died. She said, remember her saying, forms, they come and go, but life, that goes on. Okay, we'll leave it there. Our story's still not over, even though we've penetrated now into this very profound mystery. There's still one more step to take. But for now, we'll leave it there.